Sebastian. Hi, Jannick. How are
Hi,
you doing?
very good, thank you. How are you?
To see
Doing
you.
great.
Thanks for joining us on
Yeah.
something that has gathered a lot of attention this week.
Absolutely.
Just because I've seen different. Let's start right there. How many applications were actually submitted? Because I thought it
Two
was one,
applica-
then I heard it was two. It was two in the end, right?
It was two in the end, right? Yeah, there was 10 companies. 9 said they had decided not to bid, and then in the final hour, 1 came back. So there's 2 bids.
One of the
It's like a
9
movie
changed
with
their
a
mind in the
surprise
end.
ending.
Okay. I want to start there, but there's a lot to unpack here, and maybe, you're joining us because what's your role in the Danish District Heating Association? Is that the correct name?
That is the correct name. I'm head of CCUS, CDR and Biomass at the Danish District Heating Association. As the name says, we are a political interest organization, a trade organization for the district heating sector in Denmark. So all activities from producing district heating to transmission and distribution of district heating to final households and customers. So my role is sort of doing all of our or being responsible for our policy advocacy and regulatory work within the CCUS and CDR and biomass fields. So in this regard, we represent waste-to-energy facilities, biomass, combined heat and power plants that are aiming to capture CO2.
So almost all the contenders in this bid were also your members, right?
The 9 that opted out, yes, and the 1 that came back, of course. So yeah, 9 out of 10 are members of our organization.
Okay, that is a great overview. Can you maybe start us off outlining why this tender is special and unique? Because I think there's a reason why so many other countries are looking at what Denmark is doing, and let's get started there.
I think first of all, it's quite a large tender. There's almost 4 billion euros up for grabs, which will be paid out over a 15-year period starting in 2030. And I think of course, Denmark has been maybe compared to Norway a bit slow in the beginning in terms of the CCS journey, but then once Denmark started, I think the overall impression has been that it's been this speedboat just sort of trying to overtake and getting all the regulation in place and all the giving out storage and exploration licenses and setting up these big tender schemes. So this is in fact the 3rd subsidy scheme that is being done in Denmark for CCS.
Was it structurally very different this time? Because I recall in the last one, at least the one that I followed, there were quite a few awardees, and at least I hadn't heard about complaints like they emerged this time. So what was done differently this time?
Well, to start at the beginning, maybe the first one was similar to this one, which Ørsted won to build carbon capture at 2 of their biomass CHPs in Denmark. And the second one was different in the sense that it was only for biogenic emissions. So only a subsidy for negative emissions, essentially. Whereas the first one and also this current one are for CCS on fossil and biogenic emission sources, and atmospheric for that matter as well. So I guess that's sort of what was different between that second one and the other ones. And I think just overall, there's, I think the requirements for delivery in this current tender are quite strict, and that is probably why there's been so much discussion around this subsidy scheme.
So I'm wondering if because I'm surprised that there were 2 bids in the end. Right? So my question is, if the conditions are not workable, I would imagine everyone to pull out, right? But if 2 companies did put in their bid, they must have reasonable beliefs that they can fulfill the criteria, right? So what makes them stand apart? Why do they have a competitive advantage compared to the others maybe? Like, did we see bids in the end?
I think the issue overall, the main issue has been access to storage or lack thereof. And there's a lot of storage facilities, hopefully, being built in Denmark, but they are all more or less in the exploration phase, and they're not mature enough to commit to storing CO2 by 2030, or at least that's what we thought. That's what everyone thought. Aalborg Portland has received funding from the EU Innovation Fund, I think 200 and something million euros of Innovation Fund subsidies, which is contingent on them storing CO2 onshore. So it has all the time sort of been the main theory that they would actually go with onshore storage, and now they have confirmed that the bid that they have made is also with onshore storage. Now, it's a bit difficult to see how they can, in fact, make that happen, because the companies that are looking into the underground onshore near Aalborg Portland site are not super far ahead in their exploration. So someone is assuming the risk that those storage sites might not deliver the capacity that they hope for. So I guess in the boardroom, they have decided that we will assume that risk and make an application for this subsidy scheme and hope everything works. And of course, their suppliers of storage must be pretty confident that this will, in fact, work out in the end.
But there are penalties, right?
There are
if
penalties.
Things don't work out.
Yeah, there are penalties. So if they are not in operation by 2030, they need to pay penalties. Unless there's a few, how do you call that? There's a few cases where you don't have to, where you can sort of postpone your operation date. And one of them is that the storage site you have selected is delayed for a number of reasons. So that could be environmental applications, authority approvals, and what have you, that sort of caused the delay. So there's some slack.
And you said it's helpful to understand who took part. So who's the other company, or is that not public, who has submitted an application?
That is not public, and I cannot tell you.
When will it be public?
By April, when the contracts, if both companies actually make it through and get a contract, then they will, I guess, publish who it is, of course. But they have decided not to announce themselves.
But I was reading through Tobias from Concito's posts, and he said that, well, that it's implicit, kind of, you can guess who it is, because 8 of the 9 kind of said that they didn't submit, and there's only one that explicitly didn't say that they didn't submit. But again, we'll park that for now, I guess.
Yeah.
But one thing that I was also wondering here is, I understand that the price per ton that they were going to pay is roughly 187 euros, which would 1,400 Danish kroner. Is that possible?
1,400 Danish kroner is the cap on what you can require.
That's the maximum that they would pay.
That's the maximum, that they would pay. So it's a competitive tender. So ideally, there would have been, of course, several bidders applying for this, and they would have to compete for the lowest cost, essentially.
Okay.
So the cap.
But in the absence of competitive bidding, it could be that somebody got a pretty high number.
Exactly.
I found it interesting. This number seems to be oddly similar to 45Q in the US. That's the one thing that stands out to me. That's pretty much exactly how much you get in the US for storing a ton of CO2 with 45Q. But what really is curious to me is, you see this with Portland, Aalborg Portland, but also with previous winners, right? They often have innovation fund money. Then they're going to have these Danish subsidies. And then they're going to sell millions of tons to Microsoft or others potentially, right? So how is Denmark approaching kind of the financial additionality question in this complex myriad of financing that these projects seem to attract?
I think very much in the way that you actually describe it, and very similar to what they also do in Sweden and the Stockholm Exergi case, for example, where they have also gotten innovation fund subsidies. They've got member state subsidies and sold credits to Microsoft, and you stack those revenue streams, and you end up with a business case that makes sense. And Denmark is approaching it the same way. So it's also the same case that Ørsted has done when they won the first Danish tender, is receiving state aid and combining that with carbon credit sales to Microsoft. So I think that's essential, actually, to make these business cases work, at least at the price point that, like, the total cost of these value chains at the moment.
I mean, that's what we're seeing in practice. That's basically the only way you can really get BECCS projects up and running, or bio-CCS projects up and running in Europe these days.
Exactly.
You have to combine.
What's your take? Because I was talking to a Spanish BECCS developer a bio-CCS developer, and they're really unhappy with the situation, right? And I've heard this before from kind of some Eastern European project developers, because in a global market, they simply cannot compete with you guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they don't have the subsidies that you guys have. And so when they're trying to sell to Microsoft, or anyone else for that matter, their credits are going to be more expensive, way more expensive.
I mean, I guess, it maybe it's privileged to have state subsidies. I guess it could be. They're all, I mean, of course, they're all subject to the EU state aid rules. So I guess legally it makes sense, even though Spanish, or what other country did you say?
There's a Polish one, but there's a couple that I know are very unhappy.
Yeah. I can see that being an issue for them, for sure, in competing for the sale of carbon credits, really.
Yeah, but
I mean, for sure. That's a challenge and hasn't really been addressed, and it is a tricky one, because we need to diversify in Europe. We cannot have these projects being implemented only in certain countries.
I think as long as the CDR market is essentially a voluntary market, there's not much you can do, really. I mean, if I'm just thinking out loud here, if it was a sort of a regulated market within the EU, you could impose stricter rules on how much different member states could subsidize these activities, because then you're essentially producing CDR, and you shouldn't be able to give one country a bigger advantage, or companies in one country a bigger advantage than everywhere else.
And if we go back to kind of the one that was submitted, I mean, I've heard kind of the word failure and everything used, but at the end of the day, if you have the biggest emitter in Denmark storing 1.5 million tons per year, if that works out, that's huge, right? Like, I mean, again, I read that the comparison is like 700,000 cars, right? That is a huge win. So I guess the jury is still out if overall this is a success or not. But what happens to the delta? I mean, now there's two contenders, and I don't know details about the second bid. Maybe you do. Maybe you can talk about it, maybe not. But it might be that together they reach the kind of goal of 2 megatons that they were aiming for. But assuming that there's a delta, what will happen?
Well, the goal was to reach 2.3 million tons with the funds that were prioritized for this. And they won't reach 2.3. They'll reach the 1.4 from Portland plus X from the other one. And I think it's fair to say that it will be probably less than 0.5, or a maximum 0.5. So just under 2 million tons if both applicants are awarded a contract. And so the delta, I think, it's all about the Danish 2030 climate target, which is to reduce emissions by 70% compared to the 1990 level. And I think the latest forecast from the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities forecasted that goal was met, or would be met, when including 2.3 million tons from this tender. But it would be met
in 2030 already.
In 2030,
in the first year.
In 2030, they would reach that target with actually a surplus of reduction. So there's a good margin down of like 0.8 million tons or something, or 0.6, down to the sort of the limit. But if this tender was a complete failure and they didn't receive any, or if Aalborg Portland didn't make a bid, then Denmark would likely not reach its climate targets without going in and, doing things that would reduce emissions from the agricultural sector or the industrial sector or transport or whatever. So taking different initiatives, really.
That's such an interesting power dynamic. Also, right, between, like, if there's this one emitter and the government really needs that one emitter to take the subsidy, otherwise they will fail their 2030 targets.
I gotta say,
That's not uncommon. I mean, in terms of like, there are many countries that have one big emitter. I mean, I'm coming from a country like that, so
I definitely think
really
the minister himself, responsible for the climate agenda, has been, biting his nails and hoping that they would actually make a bid, because it's sort of his responsibility to reach the 2030 target. And this is an election year in Denmark, so it's kind of important.
But I mean, let's go into the key learnings. Denmark is, they're really a front runner in this space, and they are doing things, as you mentioned, this is actually already a third tender. There is a lot, obviously, to learn from this one, given that there were so many applications that were withdrawn. So what could other governments take from this, and what could they do better in their oftentimes first round, although there are several governments who already have certain types of funds available for this?
I think the biggest issue here has been that the entire value chain for carbon, for capture, transport, and storage is not really well developed. So there's lots of, say, project on project risk. So the way the Danish tender worked is that you need to take responsibility for the entire value chain, meaning that you assume the responsibility that it is captured, transported, and eventually stored underground. And if there's not a functioning market for transportation or storage, you have quite a lot of risk in each part of the value chain. That increases all the risk premiums across the value chain, increases financing costs, and it eventually might even conflict with the bid cap, even though that was quite high. So I think one of the key learnings here is to basically allow enough time for each part of the value chain to develop. We have the biggest issue here was the 2030 target. So having to deliver by 2030 with storage sites not able to commit that they would be able to store by 2030, and having high penalties if you didn't. So maybe there's plenty of incentive to deliver on these projects. You have contracts with suppliers, you have contracts with storage providers. You might even have sold some credits to Microsoft or other CDR buyers, and you need to deliver those volumes in time. So having a government penalty on top, I don't think is necessary. So that's one thing. And then, just allowing more time for COD, sort of more flexibility in that timing.
That 2030 deadline strikes me really because that's the first year of operation from what you explained.
Yeah.
And it immediately needs to be kind of at full operating potential.
Yeah.
Which seems, just if I look at any project that I followed, that's just not how these projects ramp up. So that was probably, it sounds like a very unrealistic expectation.
I think so, yeah.
The challenge is that the real track record of such projects tend to be associated with so many delays for different reasons. Whatever, licensing, permitting, legal challenges. And it's so difficult to just take all of that risk and go on and apply. But at the same time, like, we have to figure out ways to incentivize these projects to be implemented as quickly as possible, because just building in this time and for things to happen later and later, like, the whole point of climate action is that we need to do as much as possible and as early as possible. And these are obviously huge, very complex, expensive projects, and it's just difficult to make it happen. So you would say like no heavy penalties on such tenders? Like what else? Like, do you think there should be? Is it a good idea to have a tender for the whole value chain responsibility, or would you break it down? Because the value chain is the biggest problem, making it all happen at the same time, right?
I think
what's the solution?
In this market, I would break it down. Maybe further down the line, when we have more storage available, we have some transport hubs that are up and running. This system where you take responsibility for the full value chain and do a competitive tendering process will work. I think at the current time, we need to sort of separate the value chain. So governments could go in and de-risk the value chain by creating separated tenders. They could maybe do like one for storage. So go out and say, okay, as a state, we're going to contract 2 or 3 million tons of CO2 storage capacity. And then on the other hand, we're going to go out and procure 2 or 3 million tons of CO2 captured and act sort of as an agent between those two parts of the value chain. Or they could go out and say, okay, we have a very sort of promising cluster of emitters sort of near each other. It makes sense, and it's quite likely that they will all want to capture CO2 within the next 5, 7, 8, 10 years. So maybe it makes sense to build infrastructure from where they are located to a good storage site, and then they could go in and maybe invest in a specific in a pipeline or so, or even just sort of act as subsidize the infrastructure essentially. So I think it's about separating the different parts of the value chain in the current market.
That last approach is kind of what the UK is doing, right? They are designating clusters and building infrastructure for these specific clusters and not going all at the same time. So it seems to be something that at least probably one of the other next most developed countries on this in Europe is doing. I have a very different question just because it came up. Obviously, my audience is very diverse. It's not just carbon management. And so on my post, what came up quite a bit was, shouldn't we have spent this money on something else? So I'm just wondering, in Denmark, assuming that the objective was let's hit the 2030 target and then obviously help us hit the next targets, was there a discussion or public discussion on what the most effective means of achieving that would be? Or I'm curious about the opportunity costs, I guess, of these 4 billion.
There was, and there still is. I mean, there's an ongoing discussion of whether or not CCS is the best tool to get us to our climate targets in 2030 or in 2035 and beyond. Of course, that's a political decision to be made. I think you can find cheaper emission reductions within the agricultural sector still. You could also tax industry higher to sort of force them to reduce emissions by electrifying some of their facilities instead. I think there's different ways to do it. CCS is, of course, a fairly harmless tool in terms of sort of disturbing the citizens in whatever country we're looking at. It doesn't take up much space. It doesn't affect the prices of everyday products that people need to buy. It doesn't really, from a political standpoint, it's kind of easy. But I think there's also an important point in saying that some of these emission sources or emitters are going to be there regardless, also in many, many years. So we're probably going to be producing cement for a long time. We're definitely going to be stuck with a waste issue unless we become able to sort of recycle and reuse all of our waste products. I think that's a long way in the future, if ever. So we need to sort of deal with the waste that we produce and utilizing that for energy production through waste to energy facilities is an efficient way of doing that. And then if you can equip that with CO2 capture, then we get rid of those emissions as well. So there's some emitters that are sort of very likely to be in our society for a long period of time, and we need to capture those emissions.
Now we have quite a long list of projects that were pulled out of this tender. These companies have spent a lot of money on putting their applications together, and for sure there were lots of future plans hanging on to this funding being available. So, do you think there is a easy way to kind of recover this potential, like breaking the trust here between the industry and the government? Or like, what do you think happens next?
I think we're all still between sort of us and as an industry and the government. We're still in agreement, at least from my part, that these emissions need to be captured at some point. And also the Danish climate minister has said the same. So I think these projects that have pulled out are still sort of very promising projects. The ambition to capture CO2 within those companies is definitely not lost. And I know they're all sort of working, probably more slowly, but still working on their projects to sort of mature them for whenever a market and sort of regulation and subsidy schemes sort of allow them to continue. So I think they're all sort of, they're put on hold, but they're not shut down.
It's interesting dynamics because on the one hand, Denmark is moving so much faster and trying things out and trying to provide large-scale funding to such projects. But at the same time, we now learn that there are many projects that, if they would have been successful in this round, they could have started earlier than they now will in practice. So the climate impact will be delayed. But then again, these are the things we see in other funds as well, right? It's just different ways. In the Innovation Fund, we've seen large scale calls being oversubscribed by a lot, for example. So
I'm not sure that they would, in fact, be delayed by much, to be honest, because I think, I mean, if you're not able to store the CO2 at the end of the value chain by 2030, I mean, these storage sites that are going to store the CO2 eventually, they'll be operational by, say, 2032, hopefully maybe before that, to allow Portland to actually store CO2 onshore. But if they are available by 2032, we still have time within the next few years for the Danish government to decide that, okay, we're going to do another round with different different tender specifications, really, and we're going to aim for storing CO2 whenever these storage sites become available in the early 2030s. So I think there's not going to be so much of a delay if we just sort of keep the momentum going from now.
Excellent. I guess just final thing we'll have on this tender, April, you said we will have the official information, right? Okay. We'll touch base. We'll see if there's a reason to chat about it more. But for now, Jannick, thank you so much. This was really interesting, and I'm sure many of our listeners will find it insightful. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Jannick.
Bye.